My free history. We've already heard a lot about the Janissaries. A lot, really. Probably more than on any other channel on YouTube. Many of the facts I offered to you were about certain aspects in certain periods. Just look at the video about battle tactics. This was mostly dedicated to the classical period because then the Ottomans had their greatest triumphs. But I've also hinted many times that the core of the Janissaries was not a stable institution but changed continuously. In this video we will investigate the developments in the earlier times of the Ottoman Empire. We will start by looking at the numbers of the Janissaries from the earliest time up to 1600. Before we talk about this, I have a caveat for you. Some sources include the training authors in the numbers. This results in an increase of the numbers of around 30%. Whenever I had to combine different sources, I tried to correct for this aspect and only give the numbers of full Janissaries. For the very early times, that is before 1500, I mainly rely on Weinstein and Heckelhammer. After that, Agustin is my main source. But why are we looking at the numbers at all? We need to investigate this point because it enables us to answer two questions. First, do the numbers tell us something about the recruits? While a small group of people can be handpicked, this is not possible if the army numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Second, what was the connection between the numbers of the Janissaries and their tasks? Now let us look at the number of Janissaries from the founding up to 1600. Over the centuries we can observe a continuous increase in the numbers of the Janissary corps. In the first 100 years they numbered in the low thousands. Then, somewhere in the second half of the century, they more than tripled to above 10,000, although this number is still small compared to the amounts of troops a real army would need. This count remained relatively stable for the next 100 years or so. Let us talk about the increase in the middle of this chart and thereby investigate the first of 2 points stated before. Do the numbers tell us something about the recruits? Let's see if we can find this connection. To shed more light on recruitment, we should first look at the map of the evolution of the Ottoman Empire. This is the empire before 1450. In the approximately 20 years after this point in time, a number of things happened. The Ottomans' most prominent victory happened in 1453, when they took Constantinople. In 1456, the Ottomans occupied Athens and the territories around. In 1459, the conquest of Serbia followed. In 1460, Morea, which today is known by the name Peloponnese, became part of the empire. 1462 was the year when the Ottomans subjugated Trebizond. And in 1463 followed the conquest of Bosnia. Wallachia was completely occupied in 1475. In 1479, the Ottomans annexed Albania. Now let us try to combine the dates and territorial expansion with the chart on the numbers. We see here that the increase in the numbers of Janissaries coincided with big conquests as well as the introduction of devshirme. This surely is not just happenstance. As we know, the very first Janissaries were recruited through penchik. This means they were prisoners of war. You only get prisoners of war by conquest. This is the perfect place to discuss a vital piece of information I came across only after I've published the episode on devshirme. Kunt offers a hypothesis on the origin of devshirme. Most often, a conquest is accomplished at a certain moment in time, but on the frontier conditions could differ. A village may be raided, it may then submit, it may revert to an earlier status. It seems that frontier lords under loose Ottoman authority may have started devshirme in areas that had already submitted to them, as if they were still raiding such lands. Need for manpower, especially at times when the flow of volunteers to the frontier was cut at the Dardanelles crossing by enemy ships, may have led to devshirme from areas no longer resisting. This thread of thought is very intriguing because it is a much better explanation of the origins of devshirme than what we heard until now. The common explanation is only based on the similarity of the portion of prisoners given to the Sultan and the rhythm of devshirme. In this new explanation, devshirme was instituted because it was, so to say, custom to raid certain areas, and this tradition continued even after the affected villages became part of the empire. Therefore, the intensified use of devshirme and the accomplishment of conquests fit together perfectly. There were not enough prisoners of war anymore to send to the Janissaries. At the same time, with the Christian population in the Balkans now under Ottoman rule, there was a huge new manpower pool available. This bigger manpower pool fed the increase of the size of the Janissary Corps around 1475. The question why this need for additional troops arose leads us to the second point we need to discuss. What was the connection between the numbers of the Janissaries and their tasks? In order to find a fitting explanation, we will investigate the tasks the Janissaries had from early on. Two quotes we have already heard in other episodes provide a good starting point. The Janissaries were not, at the beginning, the most efficient part of the army, nor the true instrument of the Ottoman conquest that they would become later on. Initially, they were mostly imperial bodyguards who aimed to protect the sovereign, very much in the ancient tradition of the slave guards of the Muslim princes. This quote is the perfect explanation for the numbers before 1450. 2,000 or 3,000 Janissaries would be absolute sufficient to guard the Sultan and his, in those times, relatively few and small estates. In battle it was their task to cover the Sultan and not to hold a whole line. The next quote will explain the further development. The importance of the Janissaries in the military field would increase dramatically in connection with two factors. First, they became a decisive tool in siege warfare, thanks to their specific ability to act as a monolithic and compact block in the final assault. The second, and probably even more decisive factor was, following the example of the Balkan armies, the progressive adoption of firearms, more precisely the musket instead of traditional weapons, in particular bows and arrows, starting from the beginning of the 15th century. We have discussed the requirements of muskets in battle extensively in the video about tactics. Here, it suffices to say that muskets require massed use in order to have an effect in battle. Mass use is equivalent to the need for more soldiers. All in all, we can say that the Janissaries' task changed from being a bodyguard to acting as heavy infantry in battle. This role was furthered by the adoption of firearms from 1450 onwards. But aside from the Janissaries' tasks in battle, there was another reason why the growth in numbers was necessary. In the last segment we have seen the evolution of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th century. There were two other factors which did not only affect the Janissaries. Amphibious operations and longer sieges of modernized Trash Italian fortifications in the Mediterranean islands of Malta and Cyprus also added to the demand on military manpower. The casualty rates of these sieges and of the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 were significantly higher than those suffered in similar amphibious operations in the early 16th century. Especially from 1570 onwards, the Habsburgs had improved the defenses in Hungary. The standard castle was now the modern bastion fort, also called Trash Italian. The garrison troops came from all over Germany, Italy and Spain. As mercenaries, they gathered a lot of experience. In 1576 they numbered around 23,120 castles. Just like in Malta and Cyprus, these new defensive works demanded the toll in the form of Janissary blood. The casualties were either due to beaten back assaults because of the better fortifications, or because of prolonged sieges, which always killed soldiers even without a fight. But even a totally peaceful surrender of, let's say, a city could bind troops. Every conquest had to be occupied and therefore garrisoned. In addition, the new conquests led to longer borders, new, maybe even stronger enemies. Agustin supports this thesis. The increased demand for military manpower under Suleiman might be explained in part by the need to garrison newly conquered frontier provinces. So, in only a few decades the empire grew massively. We left off in 1479 when the empire looked like this. In 1566, at the end of Suleiman I's reign, the empire covered this area. Matutz tells us that the growth of the empire had another effect, which was not exactly to its own benefit. Campaigns were necessary because the home-produced goods obviously were not enough to supply the gigantic professional army and the state and religious bureaucracy. Warfare became a method of stabilization. When troops were not engaged in their learned trade, the art of war, revolts happened sooner or later. The stronger the army, the more conquests had to be achieved. The more conquests were achieved, the stronger the army had to be. In the new territories, there were a lot of new subjects who might not have taken very kindly to the new masters. Which fortresses the Janissaries occupied depended on the importance of the place. In general, military manpower in newly conquered castles was largely met by local soldiers, often redeployed from the empire's neighboring interior provinces and paid from local provincial treasuries. However, central Capukulu troops, especially Janissaries, were also sent to the key fortress in increasing numbers. Unfortunately, in my sources there are not very many numbers for the overall garrisons provided by the Janissaries in the 15th or 16th century, but at least Agoston provides some numbers on Hungary. In 1547 there were 12,131 Janissaries overall. Of these, 4,648 were stationed as garrison troops somewhere in the empire. This is 38.3%. In the most important fortresses in Hungary there were 2,282 household soldiers, which would be 18.8% of the overall corps. For 1597 I do not have numbers for total garrisons, but I do know how many Janissaries there were overall. Hold your breath. 35,000. Of these, 21.7% or 7,581 in absolute numbers spent the time in Hungary suppressing the local population and waiting on an enemy. If the percentage from 1547 can be used to guess total Janissary garrisons for 1597, this would mean that there were 13,410 stationed all over the empire. Now to the most important question from the slide before. 35,000? Yes, you heard correctly. The number of Janissaries tripled again at the end of the 16th century, but this is a topic for another episode. For now, we will investigate what the Janissaries achieved during the period we just observed. We have talked about what the size of the Janissary corps can tell us. We have considered the recruiting methods as well as the tasks. Now it is time to look at what the corps achieved during its different stages. In 1359 the Ottomans, and among them the Janissaries, fought the Battle of Kosovo to a draw. Nevertheless, in the long run, this battle proved to be a strategic victory. Since Sultan Murad I died in this battle, his son Bayezid I took over. In the battle, Murad commanded the center, while Bayezid held the right wing and his brother Yekub commanded the left. Bayezid celebrated the victory by starting the noble Ottoman tradition of fratricide, and had his brother strangled as soon as he was in command. In probably 1365 the Ottomans captured Adrianople and renamed it into Edirne. Here it should be noted that the date as well as the nature of the conquest is disputed. Veronis presents a theory by Irene Belticianus Steinherr that the occupation as well as many of the early conquests in Europe were achieved by Turkish tribes from other emirates, and the Ottomans only took them over or conquered them afterwards. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 the Ottomans defeated the Hungarian and Crusader army and thereby stopped the expansion of the Hungarian Empire. In 1402 the Ottomans suffered a crushing defeat at Ankara against Timur, who founded the Timurid Empire, which stretched from Persia to Afghanistan. At this point the Ottomans were close to vanishing from history, but it was the Timurid Empire that did not survive for very long, for reasons which hardly had anything to do with the Ottomans or the Janissaries. Sultan Bayezid was captured in this battle, and a succession struggle began. Mehmed I and Murad II reconquered the lost territories and systematized devshirme. In 1444 Murad II defeated a Polish-Hungarian Crusader army at Varna. In the middle of the battle formation stood the Janissaries and decimated Johann Hunyadi's cavalry charge. In 1448 the Ottomans fought at Kosovo again, but this time against the Hungarians and Poles. Thereby the Ottomans opened the door to the occupation occupation of most of the Balkans. The Janissaries were not exactly successful in this battle. The enemy crushed the center and was only stopped because they insisted on plundering the Ottoman camp. In 1453 followed the greatest moment of the Ottoman Empire, when Sultan Mehmed II finally conquered Constantinople. The Janissaries were essential in this siege, since they followed the assault of fanatics who served as meat shield. The Janissaries' task was to achieve a decisive breakthrough. In 1517, the Ottomans conquered Egypt. In 1521, Belgrade fell to the Ottomans for the first time. With the First Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottomans conquered Hungary, but had to split it with the Habsburgs. In 1529 followed the First Siege of Vienna. Here the Janissaries were displeased when they had to assault the city for 4 times, although for religious reasons only 3 times were required. Campaigns in the south took Baghdad and even Yemen, although only for a short period. This included fights with the Portuguese. In 1571, the Ottomans conquered Cyprus but lost the Battle of Lepanto. We have already talked about this point. Fighting at sea led to a lot of losses. So, let's sum up the achievements. Of course, there were many other battles, but these were the most important and decisive. We can count 10 victories and 3 defeats. On the map, we can see the effects. From around 1450 onwards, the empire grew from this to this. The expansion is vast, as you can see. The Janissaries had their part in it. They gave their blood and lives in order to achieve this, and in return received the opportunity to plunder and do other unspeakable things. But sometimes this was not enough. Soon we will hear what happened when their demands were not met. But before that, we have to talk about all the changes that happened. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. We can divide the period from the founding of the Janissaries until the middle of the 16th century into 2 phases. In the first phase, the Janissaries served as a bodyguard for the Sultan. This changed around 1475 when the numbers of the Janissaries tripled. We investigated this expansion from 2 perspectives. The first was the potential for recruits. We found out that the growth of the corps coincided with the wider use of devshirme. Devshirme again coincided with the expansion of the empire. This means that the new conquests provided an additional reservoir of manpower which the Ottomans accessed through the child tax. This expansion was necessary since the Janissaries had to take on new tasks, and this is the second perspective which we investigated. Conquests necessitated successful battles. In these, the Janissaries acted as a monolithic and compact block in final attacks. This became even more important when they, coinciding with the increase in numbers, adopted firearms in the second half of the 15th century. Conquest means occupation, and for the Janissaries this translated into garrison duty. Although most of the garrisons came from the local population, the Janissaries provided troops for strategically important cities and fortresses. Again, this demanded more manpower, especially when the Ottoman Empire reached its peak in the 16th century. Indeed, the numbers of the Janissaries increased further and tripled again towards the end of the 16th century, with as many Janissaries in garrison as there were overall at the beginning of the century. In the period we discussed in this video, the Janissaries were very successful. Although we see here only a selection of battles, these are the most important and decisive ones. The Ottomans won most of them, and the Janissaries played their role in nearly every important victory. And now it's your turn again. The Janissaries are now around 200 years old. What could possibly go wrong? So long, we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free,